Constitution in Colorado has been amended over 150 times since 1876.
It's really a mess. How does this govern us?
Imagine that you have a book and you have 150 authors and no editor. So you have 150 new ideas that go in and nobody to sort of keep them all straight. As a result, the Constitution has some serious problems.
I can't believe that document actually makes this state work somehow.
Unintended consequences. I think that's exactly what we have to deal with. The thing that the legislature is criticized for, and its beauty, is that it passes a lot of bills. A lot of those bills are fixing errors in previous legislation. We can't do that with the state constitution.
What we really have is this frozen marble cake full of swirls from another era, but may or may not serve the public today very well.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you.
When the Pikes Peak Gold Rush took place in 1859 and 1860, literally thousands of people flooded into the Front Range of Colorado, into territory that was divided into 4 separate jurisdictions. Part of early Colorado was Kansas territory, part was Nebraska, part was New Mexico, and part was Utah territory. So you have 4 different governments which are exercising jurisdiction over the mining regions. And all of those centers of government are very far away. So for miners who are staking claims, who are trying to lay out towns, who are trying to control the gold that they dig out of the ground, the legal system was very weak and there were very few enforcements to protect their rights.
Well, I think we were still considered the frontier. We were still trying to organize ourselves and figure out what institutions we wanted. There was an early jockeying in the territorial days regarding the Native Americans, and it was a bloody time.
Essentially, white settlers started moving into Colorado in 1858. They always had this problem of being really far from established centers of governance. So Coloradans tried to become a territory quite a few times. And our first attempt at a territory, essentially, we created an illegal one. We created this Jefferson Territory in 1861. And one of the reasons we created it is because we were really frustrated with not having a government that could help enforce water rights or protect property, or like even if you killed somebody, well, who essentially brings you to justice?
Colorado became a territory in February of 1861, right at the beginning of the Civil War, literally after Abraham Lincoln had been elected.
And of course, the great Abraham Lincoln ran on his platform in 1860 on what became the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Railroad Act of 1862 and the Land Grant College Act of 1862.
When Abraham Lincoln took office, he knew that he was going to have to create a territorial government that would save Colorado for the Union. And he also wanted Colorado to join the Union as a state as quickly as possible. Colorado's voters narrowly voted Colorado statehood down. Many in Colorado in 1864 felt that we just weren't ready for statehood. Our population wasn't big enough. We weren't organized enough. It would bring in a new layer of federal laws. It would bring in conscription into the Army during the Civil War. And a lot of people would come to Colorado to avoid the draft.
A lot of the combinations of settling in national politics and not really knowing how to organize ourselves yet. We're on the frontier, we're mining, we're fighting Indians.
By 1872, it was increasingly clear that Colorado needed to become a state in order to continue business investment, in order to create the legal systems that were necessary to protect business. And that was really what it was about, protecting the investors in mines and cattle ranching and railroad. We needed a stable legal system in order to make sure that Colorado was a good place to do business.
We were trying to organize ourselves, and it wasn't until mid-1870s that it really becomes propitious from a federal standpoint and the way we reorganize ourselves to actually gain admission to the Union.
By 1876, Colorado had received permission to write a new state constitution. Not coincidentally, it was also an election year. Republicans especially were hoping to bring Colorado in to shore up Republican support in the Electoral College. The presidential election of 1876 was an electoral tie between Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate. Colorado's 4 electoral votes made the difference. It threw that election into the House of Representatives. The representatives compromised by appointing Rutherford B. Hayes as President of the United States in exchange for a pledge to pull federal soldiers out of the South and in Reconstruction. Colorado's statehood changed American history in that pivotal year of 1876.
So there's this huge kind of economic and social flux, people coming in, people coming out. There's this constitutional convention to decide what kind of government are we going to have. These are the issues that are really kind of at the forefront. How do we attract outside capital at a time of economic depression while still protecting people from corporate predation?
Caspario Barela was, in his own way, a homesteader who had moved from northern New Mexico into southern Colorado in the early 1860s. His family ranched, they raised sheep, they grew different crops, and they negotiated with all of the different cultural groups who lived in their very cosmopolitan part of the territory. American Indians, Ute Indian tribes, Anglo-American miners and prospectors and cattle ranchers who were all coming in. And Barela was very good at crossing cultural boundaries to make alliances and friendships with all of these groups. As Southern Colorado's primary representative at the Constitutional Convention, Barela was very interested in protecting the legal rights of his constituents. It's his condition of support for the Constitution. He made that convention pledge to print the laws and the Constitution itself in Spanish for 25 years. He felt that within 25 years, most of his constituents in Southern Colorado would acculturate and learn English in time, but he felt it would take a whole generation. It wouldn't just happen overnight. And he wanted to make sure that his constituents knew their rights and knew their responsibilities in the state government of Colorado.
It's very interesting because the Constitution provided that the Constitution and statutes would be published in English, Spanish, and German. We had, major influences from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We had a lot of Hispanics, the German immigrants, the English, so those languages were recognized.
Germans were the largest foreign-born population in Colorado in the 1870s. They were also the most prosperous. They ran breweries and mills and businesses, hardware stores. There were a lot of German political leaders, and they too realized that printing the laws in German would give their constituents the opportunity to understand their rights and acculturate more smoothly in time.
You have to have a state constitution because it sets up the powers of the governor, the authority of the state legislature, and the functioning of the judicial branch. In fact, when a state applies to be admitted to the Union, the U.S. Congress adopts an enabling act. And that enabling act includes amongst its obligations that the state adopt a constitution which complies with federal requirements.
The constitutional provisions for water in the 1876 Constitution derived not only from that 1861 Act that allows farmers to build ditches across the property of others, get the water to their farms to feed the miners and grow the cities. There was an actual controversy on the ground. In 1874, the Poudre dries up. Well, the Union colony we now know as Greeley had built 2 successful ditches, and they were growing their town. They had food to eat. And then in the summer of 1874, there's no water in the Poudre. So they walk upstream and they discover that the new settlers at the surplus Army fort, Camp Collins, we now know it as Fort Collins, had taken the entire flow of the Poudre River and put it into their new ditch. Well, obviously, the people at Greeley were just a little bit upset, as you can imagine, and they wanted the water turned back to the river. Fortunately, it rained, so there was some water for the Camp Collins settlers as well. And the principle at stake was, will a newcomer higher up the stream be able to build a ditch and intercept water that people have already relied on? So the constitutional framers made sure that these water provisions were enacted that preserved this system of prior appropriation and beneficial use.
There was a measure introduced by a delegate named Henry Bromwell and another delegate named Agapita V. Hill to allow women the right to vote in Colorado. That was delayed. What the anti-women's suffrage group in the Constitutional Convention agreed to was to hold a referendum after Colorado had been admitted to the Union. And so when the election took place in 1877, women's suffrage failed. It wasn't until 1893 that Coloradans were able to change the Constitution.
We were actually the first state to give women the right to vote. Wyoming, claims it's the first, but it was just a territory then. We were the first actual state to do it. We're trying to figure out what it means to be a state. And I don't think we successfully really did that, which is why they have to had so many amendments in the years since. It was created at a very specific time, and we've had to update it so many times to kind of figure out how do we change our Constitution to fit our changing needs as a people. Coloradans' use of ballot initiatives and direct democracy has really gone through cycles. So we first get the ability to put things on the ballot in 1910 and 1912 as a result of the progressive era.
By the early 1900s, reformers were increasingly uncomfortable with being shut out of the political process. They felt that by keeping the constitutional amendment process out of the hands of the citizens, it was allowing the state to fall into the clutches of corporate interests or special interest groups. And many reformers felt that the system as it existed was undemocratic.
So a lot of reformers figured that if people were given the right to essentially put their own issues on the ballot, that's going to lead to better government. It's going to lead to serious political reforms. It's going to lead to serious social reforms. So if we just give the people the right tools, they'll be able to fight back against the interests.
So in 1912, the Constitution was changed to make it easier for citizens to propose new amendments to the Constitution through what was known as the initiative and referendum process. Citizens could petition for a specific change to the Colorado Constitution, and if they received enough signatures, they could then place that on the ballot for a popular vote.
It's the first election where people are allowed to put things on the ballot, and we have 32 different ballot initiatives in 1912, which we've never had that many ever again.
It was the first chance for Colorado voters to participate in some kind of direct democracy over the blueprint of this state.
There's an initiative to regulate the branding of cattle. There's things about regulating public utilities. There's an initiative to provide state aid to mothers and children. There's things about civil service. So it's this weird kind of dusty attic of different types of issues that couldn't the state legislature just do this, but according to progressives, they could not. It really peaks in about 1912, 1914, and then people just stop using it for a while.
Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, Colorado voters began to work on changing the Constitution to reflect changing social and political ideals.
The 1970s is the decade where all of the the turmoil of the 1960s, civil rights, Vietnam, the political chaos of Kennedy, then Kennedy being shot, and then Johnson being president, and then we get Nixon. All of that social, cultural, and political chaos, that's when we have to figure out, okay, what kind of society do we become? It's the decade of reckoning.
We use our Constitution to fight about social issues, whether it is gay rights, or it is personhood, or it's bear hunting.
The one that is really the catalyst, it's the first kind of modern ballot initiative campaign, was the ballot initiative to ban state funding for the 1976 Winter Olympics. So in 1970, Denver had been awarded the Winter Olympics by the International Olympic Committee after about 6 years of agitation on the part of the Denver Chamber of Commerce and the city of Denver. They essentially assumed that everybody in Colorado would be excited about this.
Many Reformers in the 1970s felt that this huge runaway development, as they saw it, really threatened to take over Colorado. And they felt that the people, again, had been left out of the decision-making process about where to have the Olympics, what kinds of facilities to create, and how to pay for it.
Part of it was that the Denver Organizing Committee was actually incredibly incompetent. They actually did not know how to put together an Olympics. And at one point, the International Organizing Committee for the Olympics almost took away the games just because Denver was so inept at actually trying to figure out where all the different venues were going to go. But there's two other kind of things going on. One is the rise of environmentalism as a political cause in Colorado. People who were against the Olympics thought it would increase pollution, it would bring traffic, it would bring all of these people who would come and leave litter on the mountaintops, it would spoil the rivers and things like that. Cities essentially had to bear the brunt of Olympics infrastructure, so it would have been very, very expensive for Denver to hold the Olympics. So what people actually voted on was to remove all state funding from the Olympics.
And so voters stood up and said, we're going to change the Constitution so something like this is not allowed.
So it passed. The International Olympic Committee decided to award the Games to Innsbruck, Austria instead. Coloradans got an enormous amount of both national and international attention because no city has ever rejected the Olympics after being awarded them, and it's never happened since.
It's a mixed blessing that we have more direct democracy. Citizens have more of a role in the discussion over what kind of state we are and what kind of state we want to be. 26 states don't even have a ballot initiative process. So in that sense, we're more democratic. The downside is this is a Republican system. We're not always looking out for our long-term interests when we directly change the Constitution.
I think the most kind of characteristic of these kinds of initiatives was Amendment 2. Denver, Boulder, and Aspen all had anti-discrimination ordinances that protected their citizens on the basis of race, sex, disability. All three towns essentially added sexual orientation to their anti-discrimination ordinances. Religious right organizations, particularly down in Colorado Springs, particularly this organization called Colorado for Family Values, gathered enough petitions to essentially put this thing on the ballot that would rescind all of those organizations and keep the state of Colorado from creating any laws that would protect anybody, on the basis of sexual orientation. Amendment 2 is essentially a sledgehammer. It was not subtle in any way, shape, or form. Proponents of Amendment 2, people like Colorado for Family Values, essentially argue that it would protect families, it would keep traditional ideas of morality intact in Colorado, and it would keep gays and lesbians and bisexuals from getting quote-unquote special rights. The right to not be discriminated against was a special right. We were the first state to pass that kind of law. No other constitutional amendment in Colorado history has had the nationwide impact that Amendment 2 had. We like to be the first with things, and this way we were the first, but it brought a lot of shame to Coloradans. But it's very typical of the kinds of things we're using the Constitution for in the 1980s and 1990s. So it did pass in 1992 by a very slim margin. I think it was 53 to 47%. But it never technically became law. People who were opposed to Amendment 2 went to the courts. They got essentially an injunction passed on the law to keep it from becoming law. And then in a round of court cases, both Denver District Court and then the Colorado Supreme Court both said, no, this is unconstitutional. The state of Colorado cannot do this. The reason why it becomes important nationally is that it goes to the United States Supreme Court. In 1996, in the case Romer v. Evans, the United States Supreme Court essentially said that no, Amendment 2 essentially violates the 14th Amendment. This is the first time the Supreme Court had ever ruled positively in any sort of gay rights cases. Before Romer, the Supreme Court essentially treated homosexuality as a behavior, and now it treated it as an identity, an identifiable group of persons who might need legal redress.
We have an amendment in the Constitution that people are familiar with called the TABOR Amendment.
TABOR is an acronym for Taxpayers' Bill of Rights.
Now, arguably, that has some very good features to it. For example, citizens get to vote on taxes. At the same time, it has a number of limitations on the growth of taxes, even the natural growth of taxes as the economy grows. It prohibits some taxes entirely, whether the citizens approve them or not.
I remember when TABOR was passed in 1992, and that, of course, was the third effort at trying to pass something like TABOR.
It failed in 1988, it failed in 1984. why it passes in 1992 is that most of the people that were against TABOR were also against Amendment 2, and they focused all of their energies on defeating Amendment 2, and TABOR just kind of snuck under the radar.
Ever since then, we've been trying to figure out how some of the provisions work.
And so you have this limitation, this cap on growth of spending. At one level, that sounds terrific. Unfortunately, things change. And so there are times when you may wish to spend.
Folks tend to think of TABOR only as limiting taxes, but it has many, many other provisions. For example, it says that the state cannot incur multi-year obligations, which means that many normal business transactions that you would expect your state to do, we can't do because we can only do one-year transactions. Obviously, the state has found workarounds to make it work, but every future year's funding of a multi-year contract is subject to appropriation by the legislature. That makes people that we contract with nervous. It makes it just a little bit more difficult to do.
I think that people realized, certainly the legislature realized, that there were a lot of things packed into the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that people didn't know were in there.
We have another provision in our Constitution called Amendment 23. Very well-intentioned amendment that almost everybody would agree with, which relates to adequate funding of public education. When you put them together, when you put TABOR with its limitations and Amendment 23 with its mandates to spend, it's like driving a car with one foot on the brake and the other on the gas pedal.
Colorado has one of the easiest constitutions in the country to amend, and consequently our citizens have taken advantage of that, but also special interest groups from all over the country have used us as a testing ground to see whether they can get something passed. That's led to provisions in our Constitution that just really don't play well with each other.
One of the real challenges is that although it's relatively easy to change the state constitution, once an initiative is enshrined in the Constitution, it's very difficult to get it out.
This is Volume 1 of the Colorado's revised statute, which contains our constitutions. It contains the U.S. Constitution, and I'm going to show you that that's this portion of the book, just a few pages. And then the next section is the Colorado Constitution. We have pages and pages and pages of Constitution, which in most states would be statutes, things that can be fixed or amended by the state legislature if they're broken or they don't work.
We, the people of Colorado, have retained the right to have an easier process for amending our Constitution. Now, arguably, does it contain too much? It goes beyond being a charter for three branches of government and protection of the rights that we all enjoy. Well, it's a little bit easier, but I seriously doubt if a proposition was put up to the Colorado voters that they would vote to repeal their authority to enact statutes or enact constitutional provisions, whether or not the legislature chooses to do so.
That's a Western phenomenon. You don't see amendments to the Constitution east of the Mississippi. It's out here. It's Colorado, it's California, it's Oregon. Those, I think, are the three states in which most of this has been done. And consequently, organizations that have an issue and want to find out whether they can package that in a way that's going to be appealing to voters love to try these three states. Colorado's a lot smaller and a lot cheaper to do this than in California. We get to be the test tube for the incubation of a lot of these ideas.
The only constant is change. And a state government, like a company or like an association, needs to be able to respond to a changing environment. In the case of Colorado, because of the Constitution largely, our legislature has a terrifically difficult time responding.
This is where people actually really interact with the Colorado Constitution, trying to decide these issues of which there's really no middle ground.
We seem to have this distrust of federal government and state government. We like to do local government.
The story of Colorado's Constitution is a complex one. It's about the conversations that we've had over time about how we govern ourselves and what kind of state we want to be. The Constitution describes our government, but in a way it also captures our values, what we stand for, what we think the role of citizens are in making decisions about our future. I think this is always a rich topic and one that we're going to be fortunate to be discussing for a long time.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you. This episode is available on Blu-ray. Visit our website to order. There's more Colorado Experience online at rmpbs.org/Colorado Experience.